Hello there. Today we're going to talk a little bit about a conceptual prompt for making your paintings using rules for yourself that can help to drive your work from start to finish. All the artists that I'll show today have at one time or another used some kind of rule to help them craft the work that you'll see. The image on the left here by the Dadaist Hans Arp is a great example of that. This was one of his chance collage pieces, wherein he took scraps of paper and dropped them from a predetermined height and then glued them down wherever they landed. Now, the idea behind this chance piece was that it effectively removed the importance of the artist's hand from the execution of the work, allowing something else to drive that construction. And you'll see similar themes throughout many of the artists in the following slide lecture. The wall drawings of Sol LeWitt have been hugely influential for many years. He produced something like 1,500 of these giant wall drawings, or the rules that would precipitate them, because Sol LeWitt is not required to make a Sol LeWitt wall drawing. All that is required is that someone follows through on his predetermined set of instructions. And these come in various sizes, but many of them, as you can imagine, are quite large. Here's another image by Sol LeWitt, another wall drawing. In this one, we can talk a little bit about how these get made. Often the wall is divided into different sections, which each section has an assigned way of mark making, like creating a line or a curve or dashing a line that is then executed without changing the original plan. In class, we read Sol LeWitt's Paragraphs on Conceptual Art and his subset, Sentences on Conceptual Art. And from that, you might remember these two sentences on conceptual art. Number 6, if the artist changes his mind midway through the execution of the piece, he compromises the result and repeats past results. And number 7, the artist's will is secondary to the process he initiates from idea to completion. His willfulness may only be ego. Now, this idea is pretty interesting when we think about the complete lack of the artist's hand in this work. The fact that the work is being created purely from the idea set forth by the artist, the act of creation being given over to other workers, other artists, and draftspeople, is essential to the way the work is made. Here is a diagram of how these certificates are assigned from Sol LeWitt. So you can see that he, in the image on the left, he's giving you the way to break down the wall, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then the repetition of that by combining those types of lines at those intervals, creating a different pattern as you go from just a single line to all 4 lines in various combinations by the far right-hand side of the image. And here is an image of someone, not Sol LeWitt, helping to craft a Sol LeWitt wall drawing. When it comes to making work based on strict rules, there's not really anyone more strict than the Taiwanese artist Tasheng Hsu, and I'm sure I'm butchering that name. Forgive me for that. Hsu is really well known for year-long performance pieces wherein he basically lives in some really intense way. Many of you might know the work of the artist Marina Abramovich. Abramovich calls Hsu the granddaddy, and he is like this performance art legend because of the intensity of his work. This piece is probably his most famous piece, wherein he clocks into a time clock, a worker's time clock in his studio every hour on the hour for an entire year. Each time he clocks into it, he takes a photograph of himself with a film strip and has converted all of those film strips into a movie that documents his entire year that's 6 minutes long. So if you think about this for a little bit, that means that Hsu is never able to sleep longer than 59 minutes at a time before he clocks in for an entire year. He obviously can't leave his studio for any longer than a few minutes for an entire year. And he's able to really craft this portrait of time. There's several really good videos of this. One is linked in the PowerPoint of this presentation, and I'll also put the link in our YouTube comment section. Just a couple other quick examples of Hassa's year-long performance pieces. On the left, Hassa never went underneath a roof, never went inside in any way, not a car or anything like that for an entire year, which, again, when you think about it, really means that he basically lived homeless as an art piece for an entire year. And in the piece on the right, this is a really interesting one. He was tied with that 6 or 7 foot length of rope to another sculptor, another artist for an entire year. So imagine that you're not. This is not his partner, not his wife, or anything like that. They have other people in their lives, and yet they're never separated by more than this small little amount. So all intimacy of your life would be shared with this other person, this colleague, to be sure, but not someone who's normally your intimate in life. It is a terrible crime and shame that Yoko Ono is probably best known as the wife of John Lennon and a person who some accuse of breaking up the Beatles, when in fact she is an absolutely hugely important conceptual and performance artist in her own right, and has made a lot of works based on rules. These pieces that Ono refers to as ideas for paintings are really great. They're kind of beautiful little poems that would, if you followed the rule, create a painting or a piece that she's thinking about. So, Piece for the Wind from 1962, cut a painting up and let them be lost in the wind. Painting to see the room, drill a small, almost invisible hole in the center of the canvas and see the room through it. Travel piece. Make a key. Find a lock that fits. If you find it, burn the house that is attached to it. 1964. The Japanese artist Kawara is really well known for making very simple paintings. These are made out of only 2 colors, and they are just a painting of the date that they were made. He says if he wakes up alive, he makes a painting of that day. And some of his rules are that he'll use the language and the format of the date of the place that he lived in. And of course, he has to paint it on the day that it is. So October 9th, 1966, that's the date that he painted it. If he doesn't finish it by midnight, he destroys the painting. And this kind of absurd idea, because it's taken so seriously, because the rule is followed so strictly, actually takes on kind of monumental proportions over the course of his entire career. Kawara made something like 3,000 of these pieces between 1966 and 2013 when he died. And in that context, this body of work really takes on a monumental sense of space and time. Max Ernst is a really important surrealist and Dadaist who made a ton of work in a ton of different mediums, collage, decollage, etc. But he also made a series of landscape paintings in the 1940s that I really want to talk about. This is one of those, and it looks like this kind of surrealist landscape, and it certainly is. But what's very interesting is the way that the automatic process that he used to start these pieces. Here's an art vocab word for you: decalcomania. This is the process of pressing a piece of plastic or paper against an already wet paint or ink surface, and then pulling that apart. And when you pull that off, it creates this suction that creates this whole manner of mark makings that you wouldn't be able to create otherwise. And that's what we see in all of these red, yellow, green areas at the foreground of the piece. That's actually the first layer of the painting. And then he goes back in and paints on top of that with the sky that you see and all the details that create the bull and the figures standing there. This painting called Europe After the Flood, of course, seems to reference World War II. It was made between 1940 and 1942. That's why we have to think of it that way. And so Ernst is using this really kind of unexpected experimental technique to start off what is otherwise a kind of naturalistic expression. Here's another example of one of those pieces, and you can really kind of see the detail, especially in the forms in the middle and the left, where you can really tell that the plastic has been pulled back and has kind of slurped that paint into these weird shapes. And then he's gone back in and picked out negative spaces to paint blue for the sky, or positive spaces to turn into that kind of figure right there in the middle of the place. And when you see any of these pieces in person, they're really surprising and exciting because there are forms that are made up inside these landscapes that are just really unexpected. And that's because it came from an experimental, rule based technique. Everything else that he decided on top of that helped to finalize the piece. Robert Rauschenberg is known really well as the creator of what he called combines. There's a really famous one of a goat standing on a top of a painting that you might remember. But he also was a conceptual artist in the way that he thought about rule based work. So this piece is one of my very favorites of his combine series. This is called Factum 1 and 2. And Factum 1, there on the left, is a pretty off the cuff Rauschenberg type piece. You can see it incorporates collage and splatter paint and just a really kind of you might think of it as an intuitive approach to mark making. And Factum 2 on the right is his attempt to recreate that piece exactly. And I love this because it really calls into question the idea of the honesty behind those kinds of gestural mark makings that were really important to artists in the 1950s. Think like Jackson Pollock or Willem de Kooning, and these ideas that like what comes from the artist's hand is integral to who I am and only could be made by me. And Rauschenberg, of course, is going like, well, what nonsense. I can do it once and then I can do it again. Here's another piece by Rauschenberg, and this one tends to piss off people when they think about what it is. This is actually an erased de Kooning drawing. So Rauschenberg was a pretty young artist at the time, and he asked de Kooning, who is incredibly famous, for a drawing that he could erase. And he asked him to give him one that would be really, really hard to erase. De Kooning agreed, and Rauschenberg went about destroying this drawing, and in the process making his own piece out of it by erasing the existing de Kooning drawing. Contemporary artists also continue to use rules sometimes as a way to help them create work. Frances Richardson is primarily known as a sculptor, but I've known her for a long time as a drawer, and she makes these really beautiful atmospheric type images out of graphite drawings of pluses and minuses. When you get up close to them, the entire image is crafted out of these very, very simple forms of mark making and various levels of detail within them. Here's another couple images, the image on the left, the finished piece, and the image on the right, a detail where you can see how those pluses and minuses become almost this mosaic, this swirling space that works inside there. So these are all the professional images I'll show you today. Please also check out the slideshow for student work that's been done on rule-based painting in the past. And good luck. Have some fun making some rules, working from the rules that I've provided for you, and trying to craft some work based on some conceptual prompts.